Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
There are very few people, I think, in your life who have the kind of impact. When you say that, here is this person, I'll spend the rest of my life listening to or following if I can. I can imagine in some sense, if imagine if you're at a time when the Buddha was there, you'd have felt that way about the Buddha. In time when Ambedkar was there, you'd have felt that way about Ambedkar. In time when Gandhi was there, you'd have felt that way about Gandhi. And we unfortunately didn't live in that particular time. The time we live in, the only person I can think of who's had that kind of an impact, who is Balagopal. And I think the question to ask is, why did he have that kind of an impact? What was so special and so unique about him?
You just heard lawyer Arvind Narrain, founding member of the Alternative Law Forum Bangalore, talk about the legacy of K. Balagopal, who has been described as the conscience of the collective self known as Andhra society. Arvind, in a conversation with communications coordinator Aishwarya Ravikumar, provides a primer and an insight into the inner workings of a profound and rare mind of clarity and action. In this episode of BIC Talks, we remember K. Balagopal on the anniversary of his passing, that was on the 10th of June. Now, over to Aishwarya.
Hi Arvind. Today I actually want to start off on a personal note as I think of Balagopal. I feel really great to be here. And as I ask you, Arvind Narrain from Alternative Law Forum, just some questions that Balagopal left us with, some questions that would take us very much to our current newspaper headlines, our current today's lived reality. I think everything that he said was so relevant. So I'm really grateful for being able to ask you these questions and explore this. K. Balagopal was a human rights activist, a lawyer, a mathematician, whose chief focus of work for almost 30 years was the politics and culture of his home state, Andhra Pradesh. That's why he was also known as the conscience of the collective self, known as Andhra society. He also served as the General Secretary of Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee, founded the Human Rights Forum, and in his law practice argued dozens of cases pertaining to encounter killings by the police. He traveled across India, and these travels played a very significant role in his incisive and critical work in human rights. For me, I started reading Balagopal after I graduated and moved to my first job in Andhra Pradesh. And to just get a context of where I'm going to, this is one of the authors I picked up. And what a context I got. For me, he showed me the power of nuance in an argument, the power of setting a context, the power of understanding different sides with a critical lens. And he showed me the power of compassion in critique when you humanize and when you look at things from a very humanistic perspective. So that's who Balagopal was for me. I want to hand it over to you now. Do you want to add something to this introduction of Balagopal, Arvind?
Thanks, Aishwarya, for that really wide-ranging and really moving and beautiful introduction to Balagopal. There are very few people, I think, in your life who have the kind of impact. When you say that, here is this person, I'll spend the rest of my life listening to or following if I can. I can imagine in some sense, imagine if you're at a time when the Buddha was there, you'd have felt that way about the Buddha. In time when Ambedkar was there, you'd have felt that way about Ambedkar. In time when Gandhi was there, you'd have felt that way about Gandhi. And we unfortunately didn't live in that particular time. The time we live in, the only person I can think of who's had that kind of an impact, who is Balagopal. And I think the question to ask is, why did he have that kind of an impact? What was so special and so unique about him? As you rightly put it, he is a human rights activist. He was a lawyer. He was a theoretician about the issues which matter to us in the contemporary sense. So if you put all of this together, what you get is somebody who, in a sense, reasoned from the ground up. And that is something which is so utterly unique that I really haven't sensed that in anybody else. He'd build a theory from the reality around him. in the time when we were growing up, which were the intellectual currents around us. One was, of course, post-structuralism, postmodernism. Marxism was in the wane around the time that we were growing up, and that was the environment we grew up in, when the suspicion of the grand narrative was old, and the idea of unity was deeply problematic. The idea of unity of the working classes, etc. At that time, you had someone like Balagopal come in like a whiff of fresh air, who basically said that, the way we need to look at this is in terms of how does our work, in a sense, our thinking, in a sense, matter as far as the broader principle of the value of democracy is concerned. And that was his fundamental thinking. And it's, maybe I'm jumping a little bit. Get back to the question of the way he contributed to his mode of thinking, as it were. The best way to introduce Balgopal is to listen to him, and to read him. Of course, I mean, if you read him, all his writings are out there on balgopal.org, really put together marvelously and brilliantly by his colleagues and comrades and friends in Andhra Pradesh. And in those lectures and writings, etc., you'll find a couple of talks, and you'll find a beautiful film by Deepa Dhanraj, which interviews him. And there's one particular part which we'll play now, which, in a sense, tells you the way he reasoned and the way he thought and the way he arrives at principles. And that's a beautiful illustration.
Once you formulate a protest in terms of principle, you have to, firstly, you can never formulate a protest only in terms of interests. You can never say, I am being oppressed. You have to say, oppression is wrong. That's the only way you can formulate a protest. The moment you do that, the principle becomes universal. Not universal in the sense of 100% universal, but it finds for itself a class which goes beyond you. Then what happens is that you will have to speak for many more people, which again has its own further consequences. So a perpetual expansion of the principled concerns is unavoidable in the very fact that a protest has to be expressed in terms of universal values. So once we say that torture is wrong, it's impossible for civil rights movement to say torture of Naxalites is wrong. You have to say torture is wrong. Once you say torture is wrong, you have to look at who else is being tortured. So we had to look. In the beginning, police used to make fun of us. That look, when you come to a police station asking for the release or to somebody to be produced in court who happens to be a radical, he's in the lockup. There are 10 more people in the lockup along with him. Why don't you talk about them? Police, of course, were not interested that we should talk about them. They were interested in exposing our one-sidedness. But we learnt a lesson from that. So we started saying that torture is wrong. Now, if torture is wrong, then you have to answer many more questions. Because you are saying torture not only of a political revolutionary, but also of a criminal is wrong. Then you have to answer for yourself, what is crime? What is civil rights movement's understanding of crime? Is it the same thing as that of the system, or do you have a different understanding? Can you be satisfied with a totally subversive understanding that can you say that all crime is protest? Obviously it is not. There is some crime which even ordinary people don't like, so one has to formulate a notion of crime. So the movement started expanding.
We learned the fact that we can't say torture of political prisoners is wrong. We can only make the point that torture is wrong. And from that point, okay, when you say torture is wrong, what is the principle you arrive at? And this is what he said. The principle you arrive at is the fact that you have to face your struggle, you have to put your struggle in the notion of universal, in universal terms. You have to say torture is wrong, you have to say violation of dignity is wrong, and you have to put it in that broad sense. What is the value of that again? That again tells you the open-mindedness of Balagopal, which is where it leads to. Once you say torture is wrong, then it doesn't matter who is getting tortured. You will have to condemn that torture, regardless whether you like that person or don't like that person. Give you an example in linking up to a contemporary context. As part of the People's Union of Civil Liberties, we've done a fact-finding on the human rights violations against transgender persons. At that time, I mean, now, of course, in today's context, you'll be like, what's the big deal? But at that moment in time, it was quite it's a new topic. Nobody had done that. And we were not sure what is the reception one would get within the broader human rights community. And the person who put us completely at ease was Balagopal. His point was simple. He's saying that what you're looking at is the violation of the right to dignity. What you're looking at is the violation of the right to the freedom from torture. And the fact that happens in this community is a human rights violation and should be addressed. So that you get the sense of a person who reasons not from a groundwork of prejudice, but totally open-minded to what the context with throw before him. So that's part of the reason why I like him so much. And maybe one more point. I mean, I can keep going on this, but one more point I should make is the world we see around us are made up of activists or possibly are academics. Academics speak in what Balgopal would have called incomprehensible lingo of postmodernism or other such lingos. Activists sometimes don't put it in any theoretical frame. So we're really stuck in between. And he bridged that gap. He brought activism and academia together and made a difference in terms of introducing issues which mattered in academia, which is very important. Again, you think about it, right? The gaps in academia is still today, you don't talk about the violence of the state, you don't talk about torture, you don't talk about a range of issues which you should be talking about. The only man who's spoken about it consistently, who's written about it consistently, is Balgopal. That is his great value. And added to all this, in a personal sense, he was an inspiration as a person. That's the other incredible part, right? You'd see him, he'd be dressed in the most simple attire. He'd be wearing his chappals, he'd be walking around in that particular way. And he had that sense of his life communicating by the simplicity of the life. He'd travel around the country, but he'd only travel by train. Flight was out of the question. I'll give you one example when friends from Bihar had called him for a conference in Patna. They said, come and speak at this conference. And they said, we booked your flight tickets. He said, no flight. I'll take the train and come. You're students. Why do you want to spend money on the flight? So that simplicity, it's so extraordinary. I don't think I've seen anybody else. I have not seen it anybody else, in this generation of this grouping, as it were. So there are actually many reasons why we go back to Balgopal, but I hope I've put forward a couple of those reasons.
Definitely, you have really. And also for listeners, and I'm also predicting that a lot of people who might be listening to it, who listen to podcasts, who are also young and working and on the social media all the time, don't know who Balgopal is. I don't think enough people know who Balgopal is, and I too wouldn't have known if I hadn't landed there in Andhra Pradesh. And I think you laid out a very important beginning to this conversation. I want to start from the first question that I want to bring up. Is one of the things that he said is that rights do not accrue without struggle or agitation. For me, and from how I was raised, with the kind of education we have received, we're realizing these things only now. And for instance, we must have seen this kind of whole nationwide resistance against CAA when youths came down to the streets, and there were a lot of youth who took to the streets all over the country to say that they're against CAA, and they're not against this kind of a law that discriminates based on religion. For us, this idea of a struggle that exists behind the right is something that we're realizing now. And Balgopal had said a lot at that time, that he talks about the significance of understanding rights as a result of this agitation, a result of struggle against oppression. And it doesn't come out of thin air, it doesn't come out of charity. So, will you want to talk about this a little more, Arvind?
Thank you for picking up on that. Really, I think, in a sense, a central point of Balgopal's philosophy of thinking around the issue of human rights itself. Again, that's very important, because you go to any of our constitutional law textbooks, human rights textbooks, you'll get the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you'll get the Indian Constitution, you'll get a range of human rights documents. But there's never any expression or embodiment or understanding of the fact that these instruments or these laws are really a product of a concrete struggle. And it's a way of thinking which Balgopal gives you in terms of the way you look at human rights. And it's that I was thinking of it because of that orientation which he left me with very, very early on. Simple points. If you look at, for example, Article 15, which is the non-discrimination law, 15.2 says citizens shall discriminate against any person or in terms of access to water bodies, places of public accommodation, wells, bathing ghats, etc. And then you read it we read it in the law school. You'll think, even the framers of the Indian Constitution have nothing better to do than talk about access to water bodies. And then you go back to the history of that provision, and you realize that actually it's Ambedkar's agitation, the Mahad Satyagraha, which was really the right to access drinking water without discrimination, as far in Mahad district was concerned. And then you realize that the deep meaning of this provision. You realize that actually this provision is speaking to the life concerns of literally millions of Indians around the country who still can't access water without discrimination on grounds of caste. So entire histories are there behind each of these provisions. You take again Article 17, right, which says prohibition of the practice of untouchability. Again, is that provision a product of struggle? Yes, it is. Because the simple point is that again we go back. We have to play this. You go back to Balgopal's thinking on caste. I think again we'll play a very short segment.
The topic given to me is caste and law. I happen to be a lawyer among other things, so they seem to have chosen this topic for me. Caste was the law in our country for centuries. It was a law in the sense of being a binding norm of social conduct enforced violently by those in power. That's the characteristic of law, and in that sense, caste was the law in Hindu society for centuries.
3 lines, he's captured the history of what caste means. And Article 17 is a way of combating, challenging that norm of caste being the law. So you realize the history underlying Article 17 itself. And again, see, this is not something you will study in the law school. I never studied it in the law school. You will only learn this if you at our true teacher, Balagopal, who's really taught us the way to think about human rights, in the broadest possible sense.
Like another thing that you've also pointed out for us before is what he said in how you should be marking history and one way of marking history. Do you want to say that, Arvind?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. Again, the thing about Balgopal, why we say read him, is there's a particular essay he writes on I think the first anniversary of the Sunduru massacre. And Sunduru massacre is a massacre of Dalits in Andhra Pradesh by the upper castes. And marking an anniversary, you'd imagine that you'd be slightly more banal in the way you do it. But Balgopal starts by looking at the question of marking an anniversary. He says in this country we had the history of marking anniversaries. We mark the history of the birth of gods, the death of gods, or the flight of prophets, and a range of other things. But he says surely the more model way of marking anniversaries is by marking events such as Sunduru, which should shake the collective conscience of our country. So I think in a similar way we were reflecting. We said that if we see this as the birth anniversary of Balgopal, why are we marking it? The reason we're marking it is because we think it's surely more moral to remember his birthday than my birthday or your birthday, the range of birthdays we think of or at all points in time. Not to denigrate our birthdays, but to make the point that it's in a sense of brings something very important to mind in terms of the way he put it. Remembrance is not just an act of the past; it's an act of the future. Remembering Balgopal is a commitment to the future, and that is the kind of remembrance and the tribute we pay to him. We pay tribute to him by saying that let's see how we take this forward. Let's see how we take your struggle, your ways of thinking, your compassionate, as you put it, your compassionate concern without losing nuance for the suffering of humankind. How do we take that concern forward, and how do we multiply those signs of life and existence, which are really the lives of subordinated people?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about Balgopal, it's already come up several times today already, and I think it's undoubtedly one of the most important questions that we should be addressing is the question of caste, where he talks about caste as one of the actually the last of the iniquitous institutions of the country that will die out. It is going to outlast everything else, is what he has said in multiple papers. He has reflected on this thought in multiple papers, and for me, what's very important about this learning is how he directs us or directed me to think about caste, and not just in the sense of atrocities committed, but sense of discriminations, in the sense of unwritten reservations that upper castes have always enjoyed. And he points this out in this paper called Anti-Mandal Mania, where he talks about what is unseen and what is forgotten and what is unsaid is even more important to emphasize the point and emphasize the need for reservations today, because we're completely overlooking it. We're looking at it as if merit is going to die, and this is only going to pamper minorities. This is, the death of merit is something that he constantly brought up. Do you want to elaborate a little more, Arvind, for our listeners also to get a sense of how he spoke about caste and how he considered caste to be a part of the Indian social order?
The other point about Balgopal, which is so moving, is a sense of putting your vulnerability out there, and being open about who you are. And again, here I think we'll play a short extract of an interview with Balgopal, where he talks about how he comes to terms with the question of caste. And the point he is really making is this:
We would be frequently asked. I remember when I came, I was new to because people frequently used to ask, is not untouchability a major civil rights issue? Why is it not there in your narrative? Well, what does untouchability do? What does caste in general do? It denies civic status. And civic status is the beginning of civil rights. If you talk of policemen torturing somebody in a police station, you are presuming a subject who has civic status. Somebody who has been tortured is a person who already possesses the status of a civilian. Somebody who is being arrested under National Security Act already possesses the status of a civilian. That civic status is presumed whenever you talk about civilian. But caste is something which by its very nature denies civic status itself, that you are not an equal citizen. Your civil status is half of mine, it is 1/4 of mine, it is one tenth of mine. With this kind of a system, how is it that your civil rights concern does not take up caste itself as a civil rights issue? This is a question that frequently used to be asked by persons from an Ambedkar viewpoint, and we would have, many of us would feel uncomfortable because some answer has to be given. Within the framework that we were accustomed, we would say that these are not questions which a civil rights movement can answer. Only a social transformation can bring about the changes, and we will help to protect the rights of those who are fighting for social transformation. This was the standard answer we used to give in the beginning. But only social transformation can get rid of caste. We cannot do anything to get rid of caste. And therefore, our task is to see that those who are fighting for social transformation, their political rights are protected, and that becomes the civil rights cause. This is the answer we frequently used to give.
He's saying that you don't, as a part of the civil liberties movement, we never took caste seriously. Our entire response to civil liberties movement was if there's a violation based on caste, you go and file a complaint with the police and you take it forward. If there's a violation committed by the state, we have no way forward. Therefore, the human rights movement has to step in. He says that was my understanding. That's the response I remember giving Dalit students at that moment in time. And he said, I learned through the questions my students asked me. I learned. And the questions they asked me was, why aren't you concerned about the atrocities committed on Dalits? And then he says that led me. I'm phrasing it differently, but I think he's saying that led him, in a sense, to understanding caste is really a violation of the civil status and a violation of fundamental rights. Because the way he's putting it is this: if, for example, an entire society is determined to deny humanity to the Dalit community based on its Brahminical thinking, then as far as that particular community is concerned, they have no access to any civil rights. I think, again, if we go to any village, we know that the fact that the two-tumble system exists, we know that Dalits are on the margins of the village society itself. We know that the system of inbuilt discrimination between the Dalits and the upper castes. And he says, in that context, if you're saying the person is not human, then what question of rights arises? The question of human rights only arises once you concede that everybody is human. So if that fundamental concession has not happened by large sections of Indian society, then you're stuck, you're stuck. That is your fundamental human rights challenge. There's no way out of it. You have to address the question of caste before you move ahead with any other issue at all. And so he makes the point again, we'll find the extract and play it if we can, which is, he makes the point how Ambedkar should be central to the imagination of the civil liberties movement.
And then from this point of view, if one looks back at what Ambedkar said, that when a society, what is remarkable about Hindu society is not that it is stratified, all societies are stratified. Of course, it is stratified much more absolutely than other societies. But I think most significant part of Hinduism is that
Whereas every religion has sanctioned inequality by various means, by giving it various explanations, various ideological explanations. Hinduism alone has said God himself has created inequality, you can't do anything about it. No other religion has said that God himself has created people unequal. They have defended inequality by various other means, by various mechanisms and devices. Hinduism alone said, or made God himself say in the Bhagavad Gita that I have created people unequal. There's nothing else you can do. A society which denies civic status as a matter of theory, as a matter of principle, as a matter of philosophy, as a matter of religion, such a society can never become democratic. As our friend was saying. Such a society can never become democratic until that division is annihilated, until that division is completely got rid of. Now, this is something which has, I think, to become central to the understanding of the task of the civil rights.
Again, being Balagopal, he's able to see it both as Ambedkar, central to the civil liberties movement in terms of the fact that the imagination of caste should be central to the civil liberties movement, and as well as Ambedkar as he's the committed Democrat. Again, he's able to generalize. Your anti-caste act, Ambedkar's anti-caste activism is really an activism for the democratization of Indian society. It's really an argument that Indian society must be democratized. And the fact that the state should be democratized, Nehru said it, Gandhi said it, everybody said it. Society should be democratized is a particular contribution of Ambedkar. And that is what Balagopal picks up on when he says that civil liberties should take on caste as an absolutely central concern. Because if you don't address caste, you don't address the issue of human rights in the Indian context.
Similarly, when he wrote about communalism as well in India, and when he wrote about religion, when he spoke about Gujarat and when he spoke about the Babri Masjid demolition, I can still hear a lot of that resonating with my world today. On social media, we've seen the silence of the state, we've seen the silence of the corporate units when it comes to these criminal acts of abuse, trolling, hate, in all in the name of religion. And anyone whosoever dares to openly challenge or question the state are targeted with this kind of trolling and or even sexual abuses online. And this includes abuse because of caste as well. I mean, there is a huge role that's playing everywhere. For me, I wonder a lot today, and I think that my entire generation also wonders a lot, because how this religion, the idea of religion or Hindutva today has come to be this way, and how it has entered homes and it has entered relationships, and it has become so insidious in our daily lives, and how it determines how we judge each other, listen to each other. So this is something that I wonder frequently, and I think that our listeners also would want to know how he spoke about communalism, how he spoke about religion.
There's a lot he's written about Hindutva, but I'll just refer to two articles which I think, in a sense, crystallize a certain kind of a worldview on the Hindutva question. One is an article he wrote on visiting Gujarat called Gujarat Pradesh and Hindu Rashtra. Second is an article which, as you indicated, was on the Babri Masjid demolition. The Gujarat article is a absolutely, I think, brilliant and really moving article, which combines, in a sense, the Balagopal, the activist, and Balagopal, the theoretician. Again, if you're talking about academics may not necessarily go there to write about it, but he goes there, of course. I think, as we're discussing, most probably when they're taking a train or a bus, not a flight, landing in Ahmedabad airport. He goes there, and then he says that the first feeling you have on entering Gujarat is a sense of fear. And again, he says, see, as a human rights activist, I'm not fearful that I may lose my life, because that is always a possibility that one is used to. But the fear you have is by seeing the levels of insane, outrageous hate which the ordinary Hindu has for the Muslim in Gujarat. And he says this hate is not just there in the Bajrang Dal or the VHP. It infects ordinary Hindu society, right from the housewife to the school, to the college student, to a range of office goers, range of people are infected by the insane, crazy hatred. And he says this prompts him to ask one question. Prompts him to ask the question of why is it so easy to to manufacture hate? Why is it so difficult to encourage or to put in place or to sustain attitude of love or attitude of love as far as other human beings are concerned? And then he goes on to thinking about this. He says, this question of hate has never been addressed frontally by all the left tomes which are there on the Nazi Holocaust. He says the only person who came close to thinking about it was Erich Fromm, but he never really made the full argument as such. And then his reflection really is that there's a way in which we have to understand this question of hate and where does it come from, and we have to understand and address straight out the question of love and how do you cultivate love and why is it so difficult to cultivate love. So he's asking a question at a conceptual or theoretical level, which he says has not been asked till now. And being Balagopal, of course, he's at the level of high theory, suddenly comes from the level of the ground. And then he says that you go to the villages in Gujarat, you get a clear sense that the Dalits and the Adivasis participated in this mass killing. Some people, he said, have argued that it is true that they've been in a sense the foot soldiers of Hindutva. Another level, Hindutva, he says, is given the Adivasis a sense of identity and a sense of self. And then the question he asks again, he says, sitting here, he says, I'm thinking about the fact that Somnath Chatterjee is making these marvelous speeches against the BJP sitting in Delhi. And I'm thinking that, the entire belt of Gujarat going up to Rajasthan, the tribal and the Dalit hamlets have been left free as far as the RSS is concerned, with no left and democratic forces, has been able to provide an alternative to the sense of identity which the BJP has given through Hindutva. And so he says there's a big failure of the democratic movements. This links back in a sense to conceptual framework, where he says, if you think about it, what is the post-structural critique? The post-structural critique is of the fact that the unity is a problematic notion. The fact that, you can't build a unified subject. But his point is, we understand that the differences, account for the differences, account for the hierarchies, and yet build a unity. There's no other way forward. How will you tackle this fascist project? That's the question he's asking. And he says post-structuralism gives you no answer. It's in fact empty. It's frivolous on the entire question. And he says you need a serious engagement with the question of how are we going to deal with this demon called Hindutva. And the final point he makes is, I think, which we have to quote because it's of relevance to us. He says, what Gujarat did was different only in the question of degree. That same sense of extraordinary hatred for Muslims is there in all the rest of the country. And then he goes on to say, until Narendra Modi called this hatred the revolt of the long-suffering Hindus, it was not thought fit to express it. Now that a lawful government has said so and continues to hate the government, it is no longer felt necessary to hide the hatred, and they're all speaking out. It is true that giving a wretched feeling a respectable name is essential for making it a subject of an acceptable discourse and practice. That is Narendra Modi's great contribution to the demise of Indian civilization. You go back a little bit to his earlier article on the Babri Masjid demolition. Again, that's an extraordinary article because he's asking a similar question, saying why, why did the demolition of the Babri Masjid happen? And we know that Balagopal as a lawyer is very confident. He done a forensic analysis in terms of the way that entire situation evolved. But he's asking a deeper question. He's saying the why of this question is linked in, if you ask the question among what he calls, let's see if we can find the quotation again. Yeah, just to give you his voice, right? He says, Aishwarya, I guess you'll understand that there's a deep sense of guilt. In your generation, in my generation, in the intelligentsia, you say, oh, we feel very guilty of, and say, oh no, are we responsible for this, etc., etc. So this is what Bhagavad has to say about your and my sense of guilt. It's time to be done with confessions and take a look at matters objectively. However dubious the task may seem to the subaltern theorists and the postmodernists, whose current preponderance among the progressive intelligence has one reason, with due respect for the intellectual vigor and correct intentions, for the latter's helplessly inadequate response, to the bulldozing of Hindutva. Right? And so from that, he goes on to say that, see, one reason which at that moment in time people gave for Hindutva is they said that the reason is because of the pampering by the liberal intelligentsia of people like Imam Bukhari, etc. He says, see, that's hardly the point, Balgopal's point. Balgopal's point is we have to see Hindutva as the current ideology of the ruling classes. It is the new legitimating ideology of the ruling classes. It's the way in which the ruling classes is able to take its agenda forward. And what is that agenda? The way he puts it, what is it based on? He said it capitalizes on a sense of frustration, which is there at all levels of Indian society, and moves to the level of hatred of a particular grouping. And the problem with Hindutva, he says it's a framework, again, this is the way he puts it, it is a framework that cannot express any liberating ideal, but can sanctify every suppressive injunction, everything that is negative and inhuman. And he traces it again. He says Hindutva at its core is based on the idea of hierarchy, is based on the idea of subordination of the self to a larger entity. That's the fundamental core of it. So it is based on this idea of this hierarchy of Indian society to which you have to subordinate yourself. And it is this ideology which is now the ruling ideology of the times. Why has this ideology become so popular today? He says it's become so popular because we are able to take on board this sense of frustration, which is there at many levels of Indian society, and construct this new phenomenon called Hindutva, which is really based on hatred. Again, the important point he makes is Hindutva, end of the day, is an ideology very akin to a counter-revolution. Not that there's any revolution in India, that's his words, not that there's any revolution in India, but it's a counter-revolutionary ideal in terms of it is meant to put down individual initiative, it's meant to put down individual aspiration, it's meant to put down your wanting to break out of the hierarchy within which you're confined. So the interesting point he makes is a fascinating comparison to the fascists in both Italy and Germany. He says in Italy and Germany, in the early period, they made the point that fascism was socialist, national socialism, or Mussolini again made the pretense of socialism. He says Hindutva has never pretended to have any socialist content or caring for anybody other than the core Brahmanical grouping, as it were. So this is the reason why this phenomena should be understood and combated. That's the way he phrases it.
I mean, that really helps put things to perspective today. And even now, it's important to remember what he says when we understand this language that Modi uses and the language that BJP uses. It sounds like the revolt of the downtrodden Hindu, and it definitely helps the masses. I mean, that's what I think gets through to the masses, and that's what is Balgopal trying to say, that is still so relevant now. I just want to take that to our next question, Arvind. This is regarding something that you've already brought up quite briefly. It's something that I need to mention is the way that I found strength in reading Balgopal is how he could bring details and information to life by giving them a sort of context, giving them nuance, and giving them their own identity. For example, my reading of when he writes about the death penalty or capital punishment, he talks about capital punishment, and I'm never going to forget this. He talks about capital punishment as something that is wrong in its value, but he talks about it in the sense, I'll quote it. He says, if one is okay, if one is all right with the killing of a person because of a crime that he has committed, then one is going to force himself to deny that that person exists within him as well. And it's a very unique perspective, and it's not something I have never been taught about capital punishment in this way, where I can't deny that there is an evil inside me, and the way to deal with that evil is not to kill it but to heal it. And he talks about it in this language, and for me, I mean, this is what helped me a lot in understanding different sides of stories, in understanding different arguments, because he's so critical and mathematical with the way that he argues. So I just want to connect this to how you spoke about the writing of fact-finding reports in the field of human rights, so human rights report, and how, as a good fact-finding report, what it should be according to Balgopal, and through his own example that he set up, what does this mean for the larger human rights movement? What does it mean for collective authorship?
It's a very important question you asked, because if you look at all the fact-finding reports written by Balgopal, there's nothing which is there in his name. All the reports are authored by the Human Rights Forum or the Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee. So the model of collective authorship was something he really took to mind. And again, if you speak to our colleagues and friends, Professor Sridhar from the PDF, he'd talk about, for example, when they did these fact findings in, say, Kashmir and coming back. He says everybody will be sitting and chatting in the train or whatever else it might be. Balgopal will be busy writing the report. So by the time the train lands in Hyderabad, the report is ready because he's written it in the train journey itself. And so everybody relied on him to do the writing, and the writing was done by him, but it was in everybody's name. So that model of of facing of the self and a larger collective is something which is, I think, it's worth learning from and worth reflecting upon, because otherwise so much of work, even human rights work, is about claiming credit, being there in the front, as it were. And here is this man who's maybe the exemplar as far as all of us are concerned, would never at any time put himself forward, who always subsumed himself in a larger collective, and who was, in a sense, the most important figure we have. And so it's a great model to have, to think of. Here is this guy who had this way of thinking of even the question of, what does it mean to put an individual at the front of a grouping or in front of a movement. The second part you referred to is the question of why would you encourage people to read these fact-finding reports? Here, just let me make one historical point. Actually, the report before Balgopal's report, which I found the most incredibly moving report, was actually a report authored by Gandhiji on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Again, why that report was important is one of the points, right, is General Dyer is a bad apple. He's this really bad guy. He did this. So maybe we should think the fact finding should focus on his wrong actions and pin responsibility to him. That's one way of thinking about it. Gandhi's point was Jallianwala Bagh was a logical outcome of British colonial policy. So he saw it really as part of a wider framework, and responsibility finally vested with the viceroy. It was not just with General Dyer alone. In a similar way, Balgopal's reports have that way of digging way behind under the context to get what is actually going on. Give you, examples of what the value of fact finding. Right, in Karam Chendu, again, I think he talks about this in one of his lectures on caste. And the point he makes is this. He says when Karam Chendu massacre happened, the upper caste said that it happened because of the rape of a Brahmin woman. So, and that's the language which, of course, is very evocative. It mobilizes constituencies and people. And if it's true, it's horribly wrong. But then the research they did, they said, end of the day, there are 4 or 5 Brahmin houses in that entire village. They went to all the 4 or 5 Brahmin houses and found out that such a rape has never really happened. Not just rape of Brahmin woman, no rape has happened. Right? So that you're able to expose, for example, there's a reality which, think about it this way. All we know is the reality which is there in front of us in terms of the media. What the media reports is the reality that we in India consume. How do you know if what the media is saying is true or not? And the methodology of the human rights groups, of which Balgopal is a very strong component, was to say, we will know whether it's true or not by going there ourselves. We will go there, we will investigate the question of, is it a rape? Is it this? And we'll come out with a finding. And we will educate the wider public on what is actually happening. So just at one level, the fact-finding report is just to displace the popular media narrative. That's a very important role it performs. But the second deeper level is to make the point that to dig a little bit behind why even this question of a massacre happens. And what's Karamchedu and Sunduru, the finding Balgopal comes to, is the Dalits in both villages were empowered by the standards of Indian society. They had broken the ritual confines of caste. They were not behaving as they should as far as the Hindu caste hierarchy was concerned. And it says this was offensive as far as the upper caste was concerned. And this is what is the background which led to the backlash, including the killing of the Dalits, saying that how dare you go beyond your caste confines. So in a sense, you read the fact-finding report, you get a sense of a society in churn, of a society changing dramatically, society challenging the norms of the caste order. So the massacre happens precisely because you're challenging what to you today is unacceptable based on where you come. Give you one more example of a fact finding, and then I'll stop to that. Is he did a fact finding also on the massacre of Christians, which happened in Orissa, in the Kandhamal district, and he describes how the Bajrang Dal post the massacre, a lot of the Christians left their homes and had to run away and go to the borders in Andhra, where they had to go in spite of the language being alien. They preferred being there as compared to coming back here. And he asked the question why. The Bajrang Dal put forward a condition. They said, you can come back. You convert to Hinduism. These people who are very, very poor, who are absolutely nothing with them, who are being driven to another state where they don't understand the language, said we'd rather live in that other state than come back and get converted, because our religion is part of who we are. So Balagopal reflects upon that. He says that, here we get a sense of what human dignity is about. Here are the poorest people who are saying that we won't give up our religion because that's who we are. And so you get a sense of what the issue of dignity is and how inviolable dignity should be. Again, if you read a range of the fact-finding reports, each report will find an insight. That is the great thing about Balagopal's fact findings. And other fact findings may not have the same quality if you refer to a range of other fact findings, but they'll refer to just facts at the surface. And fact finding will be maybe for a day, 2 days. At that moment it's passed, then the story is over. But Balagopal's fact findings are not just for that moment. They're for a longer period of time. They're for a historical purpose. They serve a historical purpose of understanding the domain of caste, understanding, again, the way he'd frame it, right? Understanding the issue of dignity, understanding the issue of freedom of conscience, right? Each of the issues which are central dimensions of human rights today, you want to understand. You go back to Balagopal's fact-finding reports.
No, and I also think that this kind of a writing also humanizes the people being written about, and they are not just numbers or victims, but they're also people who have a history, they have a story, and I think that is also brought to life by his kind of writing fact-finding reports.
Let me just find a short extract from this. This is from his writing it's kind of almost literary writing on the entire question of a Naxalite who's produced before the magistrate. This is basically about prisoner, Naxalite, a youth arrested under Tada and produced before the judge. And I'm just going to read out to you what he says. It was in a chastened and desolate mood that he had stood before the court. All the charges were under Tada, and there was little likelihood of his getting bail within 6 months. As he stood gazing at the distant judge and playing nervously with the chains of his wrists, his heart continued to burn at the injustice of it, though he was already wise enough to know there was little he could do about it. It felt like shouting in the court, maybe make a speech the way wrong persons do in films. But he could not get himself to do that. It was not fear that deterred him, but the sheer absurdity of it. So preoccupied the court was with ridiculous bits of paper and pieces of gossip, that there appeared to be no place there for the questions of justice and injustice that burned his heart. So remote and indifferent were the faces of the judge and the lawyers who waited in boredom for the cases to be called, that instead it fallen to gossiping with the constables who brought him to court. And there's one more extract I wanted to read out to you. This highlights a scene where communicates, in a sense, what you can call a fine sense of irony with which the young Naxalite perceives the psychology of the policeman's brutality. He's talking about being pushed into a room, an empty cell, and the policeman pushes him into the cell. This is the way he describes it. They pushed him into a smelly but mercifully empty cell and locked it up. He sat down and leaned against the wall, glancing watchfully at the policeman outside. He badly wanted to lie down and stretch out, but did not do to let them think he was relaxing. He knew enough about policemen by now. Let them think you're having a pleasant moment, and they'll thrash you just to spoil it. So he just sat back and allowed himself to look as sick as he felt. Yeah, just two extracts, which I think, in a sense, get your point, right, of the humanization, which is absolutely, absolutely there in his writing.
Thanks a lot, Arvind. I think it was worth finding those extracts and reading it out right now. And to sort of close this conversation or this discussion, I feel extremely sad about not being born a little bit earlier. And I know with your stories and your conversations about Balgopal, and a lot of friends who have had that kind of a privilege to be around him, that this is a person who inspired by just being. Is there something that you want to say about this, or to close this conversation? I'm saying to say a few lines about his impact on you personally. And I've tried to put myself in these questions that I've asked, but have to hand it over to you now because I really wish I could see him. I could have seen him. I could have been around him.
I mean, of course, he's a great one for making a point through a quip or a crack, or a joke, And he said, "No, I've not been to any foreign country as of now, apart from Kashmir." That was one of his one-liners, which made you think of the fact that of a very serious issue, the fact that the right to self-determination is a question which has not been addressed by the human rights grouping or human rights movement in its broadest possible sense. And that's an issue which he felt very committed to. He said, if people by themselves don't want to be with you, you have a right to keep them with you. So he articulated that question. Second, I can think of a range of ways in which, the kind of the jokes he's cracked around the entire question of, I think I've shared this before. One meeting in which we were talking about Justice Pasayat and the horrible judgments he had given. I remember saying that, but Justice Pasayat is retired. He said, Justice Pasayat may retired, but the judgments are not retired. So that's the problem, kind of a thing. So he had this way of, cracking jokes all the time, which was absolutely, and these jokes which had the kind of I guess, again, it's an interesting point, right? Humor can sometimes be a way in which you put people down. And that was not the kind of humor he ever engaged in. It was a humor which managed to draw us all together. And that, I think, is, again, a remarkable quality. Because how can one be humorous without being at the expense of somebody else? I think that's a question which I think about when you read his work, or you think about it. The other point which I think which communicates most powerfully about him is the idea of him as a exemplar. Again, that's something I think we all have to learn from, right? Again, within the human rights area, human rights field, broadly activism, etc., there's a certain bit of the politics of judgmentality, right? I can pretend that I'm purer than you, I'm doing far better than you. Look at me, I've ticked so many more boxes than you as far as marginalization is concerned. I can make fun of the fact that you haven't that you were wrong on one point, or that your identity is problematic, etc. Right? And what I learned from him is that no point in time was there ever a judgmental word he ever passed against anybody. He'd be like, "This is the life I lead. This is who I am." And it's for people to follow or not follow. Not that following was on his mind, but he didn't see that putting you down or make guilt. Yeah, that's the point. He never thought politics was a way forward by making you feel guilty. Guilt was not a way forward as far as he's concerned. He's always making fun of the of the liberals and the progressives who are always enmeshed in the show guilt. So guilt, what are you guilty about? We have work to do was broadly his. So I think the other point, of course, is the point that we have to think of a way beyond the divide between academia and activism, and think of traditions to bring this together. This is particularly important today because, again, in the terms of the world we are in, where Balgopal, in a sense, understood or analyzed the phenomena of Hindutva as that particular expression of the ruling ideology of the moment. He understood the question of the caste domination, caste exploitation as well. But in that same way, how many academics engage with the concerns which they should engage with? And that should be a lesson to us as well, saying that can our writing, can our thinking, can our work be of relevance to the communities, of the groups which are out there in the wider world, where this kind of learning, this kind of thinking would make some kind of a difference. So again, the point being that you're writing, right? How do you write? His writing, if you understand his writing, you refer to the mathematician behind the writing. His writing, or well described, as a clarity of a window pane, right? That is, language was not a medium to obfuscate thought. Language is a medium to communicate thought. The only reason language is there is to communicate an idea. It's not there to make things pretty and make things beautiful, etc. It's there to communicate ideas. It's not there to complicate things and make it difficult to understand. You have to communicate ideas. That's the idea which he puts forward. So that's another lesson which one takes from Balagopal. I think the other thing you learn from Balagopal in that personal sense is, I remember he'd come to Bangalore very often to give talks on many issues. And the first time, once he came to Bangalore, he said, "I apologize, I can't speak. I understand Kannada, but I can't speak in Kannada. I apologize." And he spoke in English. The next time he came, he began by saying, "I wanted to say I apologize for not speaking in Kannada, but then I realized an apology is particularly meaningless if you've done nothing to redress the problem." So I think that's a fascinating point. And again, I was thinking about it because when we're doing a little bit of work on the entire question of apology in international law, the independent expert is on apology is called the independent expert on apology, truth, and non-recurrence. Right. So the idea today, in a legal sense, of apology is linked to the question of non-recurrence. So in a sense, Balagopal, in just that spontaneous conversation that day, communicated to me an idea which I've held since then. The idea that, apologies are meaningless at the level of law, at the level of broadest possible level, if we don't do anything about it. An apology is not a backward-looking gesture, but a forward-looking gesture. When I apologize to you, it's not just about what happened in the past. It's fundamental to it is that what happened in the past will never happen again. And that should be part of your apology. And that's what he teaches us, by his very simple articulation.
Thanks a lot, Arvind. And I feel really grateful. It's a very humbling chance for me to be able to come here and ask the questions that I wish I could have asked before, or if I would have been born before. But be that as it may, it's still always so. It feels such a significance whenever I read or talk about Balagopal, or I learn more and more about him. The more I learn, the more I realize how much he's still relevant today, and how much it's still so important to read him today. And I don't know when it's not going to be important to read him.
Thanks, Aishwarya. And also, I think what is very nice is that we had this conversation, in a sense, from almost different generations in terms of understanding or engaging with Balagopal's thought. And I was speaking to colleagues who worked very closely with him and saying that I'm having this conversation with you. They were like, how fantastic is that? Because for them, they didn't realize that Balagopal's thought had really moved, in terms of newer generations as such. The fact that it's moving is obviously a great credit to his thought. And also it's fantastic that connect is really happening, and we should try and see how we can take that forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.